Welcome everyone to another YIVO Fellowship lecture. Our lecturer today is the 2023-2024 recipient of the Ruth and Joseph Kremen Memorial Fellowship in Eastern European Arts, Music, and Theater. Her talk is entitled Der oytser formen baym Ryback's Formal Approach to Jewish Art. And like I said, we'll be getting started in just a couple of minutes. As I mentioned, if you'd like to let us know where you're coming from in the chat, please do so. We have someone from Montreal, someone from Upper Montclair, New Jersey. I don't know if there's a Lower Montclair, New Jersey. Maybe there is. That's a question that I'm going to have to look into. Okay, again, welcome to another YIVO Fellowship lecture. We'll be getting started in just a minute. Please let us know where you're coming from in the chat. Someone just chimed in from Warsaw, Poland. Our lecturer today is Noa Tsaushu. She is the 2023-2024 recipient of the Ruth and Joseph Kremen Memorial Fellowship in Eastern European Arts, Music, and Theater. And like I said, we'll be getting started in just a minute or two. I see in the chat we have someone from San Diego, and there's a correction or little information about Upper and Lower Montclair, New Jersey. There is no Lower, just a general Montclair. Good to know. Thank you. All right, there you go. Yes, very nice. Welcome to another YIVO Fellowship lecture. We'll be getting started in just a minute. I see people are chiming in from Berlin, from Chicago. Excellent. These YIVO Fellowship lectures are always very international, so that's it's nice to hear where everyone is coming from. Oh, nice. Someone just noted that Ruth Kremen, the sponsor of this fellowship, was their neighbor and friend, and they're happy to know that that they sponsored this. Very nice, very, very nice. Okay, I think we can get started.
All right.
Okay, wait a sec. I have to read your bio. Sorry. Okay. Welcome everyone to another YIVO Fellowship lecture. Today's lecture is the Ruth and Joseph Kremen Memorial Fellowship Lecture in Eastern European Arts, Music, and Theater. Our lecturer today is Noa Tsaushu, who is a doctoral student of Yiddish Studies at Columbia University. She earned her master's degree in Jewish Studies from Bar Ilan University and her bachelor's degree in Fine Art from the Bezalel Academy of Arts and Design in Jerusalem. Guided by a comparative approach to cultural production, Noa specializes in modern Jewish art and Yiddish literature. Her dissertation, entitled Yiddish Art, the Desire for Cohesion Among the Soviet Yiddish Avant-Garde, presents a theoretical framework for understanding the Yiddish avant-garde movement, a phenomenon in modern Yiddish culture that has been primarily approached in scholarship through historical and literary lenses. Noa is this year's recipient of the Ruth and Joseph Kremen Memorial Fellowship in Eastern European Arts, Music, and Theater at the YIVO Institute for Jewish Research. And she recently translated and contributed to a volume of works from the Merrill C. Berman collection entitled Jewish Artists, Jewish Identity, 1917 to 1931. Her lecture today is entitled Der oytser formen baym Ryback's Formal Approach to Jewish Art. And just before we start, I want to let you know that if you have questions, please leave them in the Q&A section of the Zoom, not the chat, the Q&A section, and we will get to them when the lecture is over. Okay, thanks so much, Noa.
Thank you, Eddie. Thanks for organizing this and many other fascinating talks that I've attended throughout the years. And thank you for the Fellowship Committee for allowing me the opportunity to spend so many time in the archive. And thank all of you from all over the world for taking the time to be here today. Before I start, maybe just one thing. I want to note that this talk refers to a lot of visuals. So to make it easier on the eyes, Whenever you don't see, whenever you see an image without a credit, that means that it came from the Evo archive. Every other image should have a credit on it. And if you're further interested, you can just ask after the talk or just drop me an email and I'll happily share the resources. All right, let me start with sharing the screen. So this work follows the work, this talk, there you go. This talk follows the work of Jewish Ukrainian artist Issachar Ber Ryback. From his early days as an art student in Kiev in the 1910s, to his years in Berlin in the 1920s, to his 25 expedition to the Jewish agricultural settlements in the southern Ukraine and the Crimea, right before he left Eastern Europe and settled in Paris. A close look at Ryback's lithographic album and writing of the time reveals a synthesis of materiality and visual representation that takes place within the two-dimensional plane. I argue that through the synthesis, Ryback managed to defy conventions of monolithic medium, push back against the Western European notion of Jewish aniconism, and challenge the hegemony of text as the Jewish medium of choice. German literary critic Peter Berger, sorry for mispronouncing the umlaut, described the synthesis of the media in the early avant-garde painting as an intrusion into a previously impervious system. If in Renaissance tradition, artists subjected the surface of the painting and the image that is being depicted to the same internal logic, then collage and the intrusion of mixed media disrupted the sense of unity. We see here how pieces of newspaper, a material that is foreign to the traditional domain of painting, fracture the semblance of art that is reconciled with reality just simply because it portrays it. Once this facade of reconciliation is fractured, it reveals fragmentation as the dominant principle, both in art and life. In the time I have today, I want to question the efficacy of this cubist model of fragmentation beyond the Western European canon of art history. And I will turn to the margins of the avant-garde movement and look at an overlooked model of fragmentation that complicates the prevalent conception of one of the most conspicuous avant-garde gestures. I suggest that Soviet Jewish artists such as Ryback did not employ the synthesis of the media to assert further fragmentation, but rather they repurposed the synthesis to reclaim media that was marginalized from traditional Jewish culture. This act of reclamation is a central tenet in what I refer to as Yiddish art, art that grapples with Jewish notions of representation. Behind the synthesis, I identify a desire for cohesion that sustains a dialectic relation with the avant-garde's infamous proclivity for destruction. So, Ryback was born in 1897 in Yelizavetgrad, now Kropivnitsky, Ukraine. His traditional Jewish education began relatively late and was quickly replaced by art education. By the age of 12, he had attended painting and drawing classes and had already worked as a craftsman, painting decorations and ornaments in local monasteries. In 1912, at the age of 14, he attended the Kiev Art School, where he studied intermittently for 6 years alongside other Jewish students. Having grown disappointed by the school's academism and disregard of Jewish themes, Ryback entered the studio of Ukrainian avant-garde artist Alexandra Exter in 1918. And under her mentorship, he started to experiment with formulations of folk art and European modernisms and was able to cultivate notions of national determination alongside formal innovation. The inauguration of the Kulturliga's art section that same year was a successful attempt to conflate the two from a Jewish standpoint. The art section was highly instrumental in the production of visual and material modern Yiddish culture, and Ryback was a founding member of the art section. He served as its co-director. He illustrated books and journals. He designed sets for theater productions. He also participated in communal artist residencies, and he taught painting and drawing in the studio's art studio. And just to give you a sense of history, actually, here is
Noah, sorry. We can't hear you.
Hear me at all?
Now we can hear you.
Okay, when did you last hear me then?
You were about to explain what these buildings were.
Okay, so this building is the art section, was the art section of the Kulturliga in the heart of Kiev. It's located in 61B Vladimirskaya Ulica, and I'm actually not sure if this building is still standing, but these images are from 2017. So I'd like to pause at this point and present a few paintings by Ryback from his art school years. Unfortunately, the paintings don't exist, and the only evidence we have of them is through a personal account written by artist Manet Katz 1 year after Ryback's passing. So Katz, another Jewish Ukrainian artist, was a fellow student at the Kiev Art School, and he writes, In Kumendik noch de Chagoes, zurück in der Heym, von der Heym zurück in der Molerschule, bringt Ryback mit neue Bilder von Jiden. Wait, I can't see the entire frame, hold on. Tanzendicke Jiden, lange, schmale, amol a Wasserträger, amol a Balegule und amol gore Ziegele. Die Lehrer von der Molerschule haben als gewollt einreden Rybacken. Soll aufhören molen jüdische Sujeten. Aber Ryback pflegt auf die alle Rede entfern mit der Schweig. Und auf der neuen Ausstellung von der Schule pflegen wir sehen wieder ein jüdisch Bild, untergeschrieben deutlich Ryback. So I find this description useful because it points out Ryback's inclination towards Jewish scenes or a Jewish subject matter. Katz mentions human bodies in motion, homestead animals, and traditional skilled workers, all rendered Jewish subject, sorry. But what makes the art itself Jewish? Later in the text, Katz sums up Ryback's artistic stand as it came to fruition throughout the years, and he pays particular attention to Ryback's long-standing commitment to the formal tenets of what he refers to as Yiddishkeit. Subject matter, Katz emphasizes, hold on. Yes. Subject matter, he emphasizes, is not the cause, but the means through which Ryback was able to tap into Yiddishkeit. And he writes, Und davke mir, was haben kimat das ganze Leben gemalt jüdische Sujeten, haben sehr gut verstanden, als nicht in Sujet liegt die ganze Jüdischkeit. Und es nicht der Fall ist man ein jüdischer Künstler, was me mal Typen von jüdischen Leben. Aber bei Rybacken ist der jüdische Sujet nicht gewinn a poschete Heusofe. A Zugab zu der künstlerischen Form, was hat ständig gesucht und gefunden. Bei ihm ist das gewinn der Inhalt von dem Tagtäglichen. Und als hat gelernt und als was hat gekannt, hat reingelegt in Ort das Tagtägliche. Sein Wasserträger, sein Eufeshändler, sein Schatchen und die andere. So what do we see here? We have, again, traditional skilled workers, we have homestead animals, and probably some utilitarian or commonplace goods that are recalibrated based on their formal qualities, not illustrative. So we learned that for Ryback, subject matter serves as a repository of forms. It is less of a narrative device as it is a formal device. And this stand is further developed in a programmatic essay that Ryback co-authored with another Jewish Ukrainian artist, Boris Aronson. The essay, published in 1919, titled Die Wegen von der jüdischer Malerei, Paths of Jewish Painting, tries to pin down the essence of national art and Jewish art in particular. Ryback and Aronson provide a historical overview of national arts, yes, from antiquity to present times. And when they discuss 19th century contemporary art, they reprimand the Russian peredvizhniki style and what they refer to as its Jewish equivalent, quote unquote. So the peredvizhniki, the wanderers, were a group that broke with the neoclassical tradition of the St. Petersburg Academy of Arts, and of no less importance, its patron, the Tsarist government. The group organized traveling exhibitions, hence the name, the Wanderers, so that the common people of the provinces would have a chance to view the achievements of Russian art. They advocated for realism and centered the peasantry as their primary subject matter. In political terms, the narod, right? The revolutionary class that is destined to overthrow the monarchy. The Jewish передвижники, as Ryback refers to them, were not a group, but painters who were similarly committed to creating their own national ethos. Painters such as Samuel Hirschenberg, Leopold Pilkhovsky, and even Leonid Pasternak, who employed a naturalist style when depicting traditional Jewish scenes. The result, Ryback argues, and I'm quoting him, was nothing but plagiat von der Natur, so plagiarism of nature, fotografias in Farben, pictures in colors that paint life as it is and not as an artist would perceive it to be. And he writes, Wie die russische Peredvizhnikis, azoi haben euch die jüdische gesuchen zu schaffen die nationale Kunst durch dem, was sie haben gemalt Sujeten von jüdischen Leben. Sie haben aber nicht übergedichtet die Formen von Volksleben in ihre malerische Auffassungen. Sie haben nur illustriert das Leben. Ihre Suchenischen auf dem Gebiet von nationaler Kunst haben darüber zu gar nicht mitgebracht. So, I'd like to stop here with this dramatic statement and fast forward to 1923 to see how Ryback develops his formal approach to national art. And the works I want to discuss are from a lithographic album titled Shtetl, Mein khorever heym, a gedekhenish, that was published in Berlin in 1923, again by Verlag Schwellen. In 1921, Ryback had moved to Berlin and spent 3 years in the city as part of a circle of Russian Jewish émigrés who escaped the persecution in Ukraine and the political instabilities of the early Soviet state. And I should note that even though the album was published in 1923, the majority of the plates are dated 1917 and were initially done during or shortly after an expedition that Ryback took through the Pale of Settlement. In 1915 through 1916, he traveled together with another artist, Eli Sitsky, through the towns and shtetls of Ukraine, Belarus, and Lithuania in search of traditional Jewish art. So very much a narodnik sentiment that echoes the politics of the peredvizhniki, but is also modeled after the ultimate Jewish narodnik, Shin Ansky, and his ethnographic expeditions that started taking place 4 years earlier in 1912. But by now we know that for Ryback, thematic Jewish vignettes are an opportunity to formally explore the visual and plastic motifs that make up the traditional Jewish landscape. And we can see that the spatial and temporal distance from the pre-revolutionary Pale of Settlement provided him a sense of historical perspective and a license to intervene in an otherwise ethnographic or realist stand. As history unfolded, the Russian Empire collapsed and gave rise to the Soviet Union, with revolution, civil war, and genocide rapidly ensuing. For the Jewish Ukrainian population, the post-revolutionary years brought about destruction and carnage of unparalleled magnitude, with an unprecedented wave of pogroms. Entire communities perished, hundreds of thousands of people were killed, and millions were displaced. Ryback also suffered a personal loss when during a 3-day pogrom that took place in 1919, his hometown was destroyed and his father was murdered. So the 31 lithographic plates in Shtetl offer a comprehensive gaze into Ryback's childhood landscape, by now an obliterated, inaccessible backdrop. Ominous dark tones and contorted proportions depict everyday scenes of a subject matter that has been mutilated beyond recognition. And the plates are highly populated by everyday objects, vernacular architecture, skilled laborers, and common trade. In other words, an omnipresence of patterns and textures, volume, and mass. But unlike the cubists who employed fragmentation to disintegrate the object in its entirety, Ryback came up with his own ruse to describe a marginalized Jewish anxiety. Choosing to keep his objects intact, he distorted their spatial coordinates to the highest point of tension, calling attention to their formal attributes. This manipulation results in oblique objects that evince a sense of emergency, objects that reveal their potentiality to destroy or to be destroyed. And this tension is exacerbated by similarly distorted architecture, erratic frame arrangements, and color discord, unmistakably expressionist. So let's have a look. Among the oblique objects in Shtetl, we find a mirror whose vertical axis has been elongated and tipped forward. The subtle gesture punctures the sense of domesticity and gives way to terror. Devoid of reflection, the mirror becomes a threat. It looms over the scene, no longer able to reflect the world around it. The uncanny feeling is amplified by a steep couch with a menacing backrest that seemed to encroach upon a petrified human occupant. The knitting needles, a token of intimate craft, are placed upside down and hover in midair like a ghost. And similar to the speared legs of the side table, the needles converge into a crux and reveal a weapon-like presence. The oblique objects in Der Shadchan are perhaps harder to spot among the curvilinear topography and human contours. I think most visible is Ryback's choice of color here, which is a dominant burnt sienna that brings out the soil as kind of the all-encompassing matter from which both pedigree. Their figures are
No, I'm sorry. You froze for about 30 seconds. Sorry.
Sorry, guys. This is my home, not the campus where internet is abundance. So let me go over the last slide again. Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Okay. So I'm talking about the Shadchan, plate number 8. And I'm talking about the social interaction between the matchmaker and the 3 elderly women who seem to be burdened by the national task of propagation. The matchmaker is the most convoluted. His body expands and extracts, forming a disfigured contour. And if you look, substituting his abdominal area as an umbrella, sharp on one end and coiled on the other. Ryback rotates the object horizontally so it becomes hazardous. Repositioned, it resembles a dagger that is about to devour the matchmaker's intestine. And the visceral quality is not accidental. In the wake of the pogroms, the umbrella, as are the mirror, the needles, the side table, are all indicative of a reality in which everyday objects store the potential of violence. By contrast, the handkerchief that is about to fall off the matchmaker's pocket signifies a subjugated type of object that functions as an extension of the human body. With its paisley, organic-like pattern, the flaccid piece of textile evokes the appearance of a slimy internal organ that has been pulled inside out. As the album progresses, we find more and more oblique objects, such as the bookcase and the cane in Kalematonis, plate number 10. Suspended in diagonal position, they pose an imminent threat to their respective humans. Here, though, I want to focus on Ryback's rendering of the chair, which I find noteworthy because as an object of discursive contention. So if we go back to Western Europe for a moment, in 1912, alongside experimentation with paper, Picasso and Braque began to employ oilcloths and paste them onto canvases and cardboards, paperboards. And these machine-printed sheets, kind of like an older version of the contact paper, feature patterns that look like different materials. So we get prints of wood grain or rattan weave that were pasted next to traditional drawings made with oil color, for example. The provocation of one material disguised as another was a milestone in the evolution of Cubism and made rattan weave synonymous with the movement's material arsenal. Ryback's rendering of the cane in Kalematones, references the Cubist model of fragmentation, yet remains homogenic as far as the treatment of the surface is concerned. We see how Ryback develops an internal synthesis that manages to unsettle the two-dimensional plane without jeopardizing the medium's function altogether. The medium's symbolic function, I should say, altogether. In other words, the oblique objects in Shtetl present a model of fragmentation that diverges from the Cubist model insofar as it repurposes the synthesis to annex and authorize material and visual presence within the Jewish representational realm. And in 1918, critic Abraham Efros published an essay on the revival of Jewish art titled Aladdin's Lamp. In it, he describes two opposing gestures that separate a contemporary artist from a future one. And he writes, "The contemporary progressive artist can be recognized by one infallible indication, his predilection for deforming the objects being depicted. The artist of the future will straighten them up like a Lord God setting the fragmented world to rights in beauty and harmony." So for Efros, the act of deforming an object and the act of straightening it up must be temporarily separated in order to make historical sense. For Ryback, however, these are two opposing ends that inform a dialectic approach to art. And to conclude the main intervention in Shtetl, I would say that the oblique objects in the album are manipulated and arranged in compositions that articulate a syntax of perpetrator and victim. The album is usually discussed in reference to Cubist and Expressionist influences without addressing the inherent question of representation in Jewish culture. Acknowledging that manipulation and distortion are acts of abstraction limits or reprioritizes the mimetic gesture to relational violence. The oblique objects in the album are ethnographic artifacts or general commodities that were manipulated by Ryback to emphasize the formal idiosyncrasies of Jewish history. In terms of art history, the formal occupation synthesizes notions of palpability and plasticity, again, that were foreign to the traditional domain of painting, if you remember the Renaissance tradition. In terms of Jewish art history, we see how Ryback repurposes the synthesis as an aesthetic act of cohesion. He reclaims visuality and materiality and broadens the jurisdiction of painting within Jewish cultural sphere. I'd like to stop here again and fast forward to 1926 and look at a different album. So 1926, the year that Ryback arrived in France and joined the vigorous artistic scene of the School of Paris. That same year, he published in Paris a lithographic album titled Auf die Idische Felder von Ukraine, on the Jewish fields of the Ukraine. The album includes a foreword written by Ryback, and it came out in 3 editions, Yiddish, French, and English. It is the culmination of a visit that Ryback took in 1925 to the Jewish agricultural settlements in southern Ukraine and the Crimea. And the settlements were part of a Jewish colonization project that was initiated and funded by the Agro-Joint, a subsection of the JDC, the American Jewish Joint Distribution Committee. The project was made possible during the new economic policy, which enabled the Americans to step in and exercise their authority where the Soviets have failed. So to give you a scope of the project, In December 1924, the JDC signed an agreement with the Soviet government, and under this program, which terminated in 1937, the JDC was able to resettle over 100,000 Jews on 1 million acres of land and create 5 autonomous districts at a cost of $16 million. So the objective behind this massive project was twofold: to regenerate local production amidst a financial crisis, and to address the Jewish question by resettling unproductive Shtetl dwellers in the Black Sea littoral. So, in other words, the productivization of Russia's Jews. Now, we know from previous scholarship about the scope and innovation of the JDC's publicity campaigns, which included brochures that were disseminated across the US and outside. They produced topical radio broadcasts, and they even made promotional films in the colonies in order to raise funds. A documentary titled Jews of the Land was produced in 1926 with a screenplay by one Vladimir Mayakovsky, for example. So this is precisely where Ryback comes in. As an attempt to manufacture an image of operational success and ideological optimism, the JDC hired at least 2 artists that I know of to visit the colonies and produce this type of impression. Internal correspondence between between JDC officials and another artist who visited the colonies 2 years after Ryback make clear the terms of the assignment, and I quote: "To contrast the misery of the Shtetl with images of Jews of the soil, fine types of men and women who have been made strong and healthy through their life in the open air," end quote. So, given the demise of his native landscape, it's not surprising that Ryback was looking for Jewish subject matter beyond the Pale, and the colonies seem to have held the most promise. But in the new reality of land cultivation, far from the mercantile life of the Shtetl, Jewish material culture could no longer serve Ryback as a formal repository. Agrarian technologies took over the economy of small services and artisanal craft, and religion and class became enemies of the state and could no longer be represented by the accumulation of goods. With the center of focus shifting to industrialization, Jewish folkloristic paraphernalia was simply out of context, rare and ideologically fraught. So where would Ryback find his shapes and compositions now that his precious old trove has been outmoded? What indicative material culture could he find beyond the confines of the Pale? Let's have a look, shall we? So, Auf die idische Felder von Ukraine follows a day's work at the farm. From the early hours of the morning through high noon to sunset, in between we get a glimpse of daily tasks, social dynamics, gender roles, and personal ways of performing labor. The vignettes blur the boundaries between personal impression and reportage, and they present a type of pacified reality, far from anything that Ryback had produced in recent years. Human silhouettes are proportional and at ease, and facial expressions are no longer grotesque. The surrounding landscape is placid and unthreatening. Brush strokes are soft, chalk is diffused, and pencil lines are ameliorated. Ryback's short time in Paris seemed to have alleviated his pain and refined his technique to the point where crisis, rupture, and trauma are no longer visible. And the object that I want to focus on is noteworthy precisely because it defies this semblance. So, titled Abendstimmung, plate number 18, presents a day's end, a contemplative moment of rest where husband, wife, and a single horse shared their industrious demeanor and come to terms with their exhaustion. The lethargic atmosphere permeates every aspect of the farm. Soft strokes of weed bow down and transform the steppe into a feathery bed. A paired plow and harvester on the lower right are retired for the night with a rod and chains that have succumbed to gravity. Everything seems to surrender to the rural lassitude that took over the farm. One object, however, refuses to release its own tension. A slanted wooden closet clumsy, and bourgeois, is imposed mid-frame, so useless it's ignored by men and animal alike. So the closet, Schafe in Yiddish, is no doubt a vestige, a symbol of former status. And now that we're kind of familiar with Ryback's domestic scenes in Shtetl, the visual archetype should be clear. And I'll show you another plate from Shtetl. A bulky type of furniture that serves religious or everyday purposes, slightly ornamented, but whose craftsmanship deems it heimish rather than fancy. Once vertical, in Ryback's universe, it will most likely tilt as if about to crash. The stooped Schafe in plate number 18 is directly transported from the domain of the Shtetl. And while it seems hollow and dysfunctional at first, its dark tank is filled with purpose. Displaced in the middle of the field, the oblique object, quite figuratively, cannot align with the new reality, thus making visible any repressed misgivings towards the new circumstances. 3 years after Ryback introduced the archetype of the oblique object, he continues to develop it, this time assigning it agency. So the Schafe here agitates the scene. Devoid of utilitarian function, it transforms into an active, dissident object, which precisely makes the task of contrasting the misery of the Shtetl with images of Jews of the soil far less seamless than the JDC or the Soviet state hoped it would be. In the political climate of 1926, this subversive stand, formal and thematic, should not be taken lightly. But disruption is not the only force at play. Ryback's decision to include the Schafe in the frame also serves an opposite purpose, to salvage the object from historical ruins. The urge to cling to a bulky piece of furniture and drag it into the steppe is not commodity fetish, but rather an act of reconstruction, an attempt to restore material and visual sensibilities that were so brutally severed. Ryback might have taken on the official task of reporting a glorious new reality, but he was just as invested in the past as a project of reclamation. And here is where the main intervention of this album is defined, in my opinion, and with it, another distinctive feature of the Soviet Yiddish avant-garde, which is to provide aesthetic means of resistance and offer a sense of material and visual continuity to its traumatized Jewish community. Turning to Ryback's writing affirms this dialectic impetus. In the foreword to the album, he describes the objects that are revealed to him. So these are Lopates, Ackereisens, Schneidmessers und andere Machschirim, gewöhnliche Detallen auf a jiddischen Häuf. And amongst these foreign objects, he recognizes the closet as something familiar, something from the old world. Nur etwas hab ich da der Sehne soins. Es hat mich gleich der Monton dem Shtetl Steger. Zugetuliert zum Barack steht eingehäukert mit den ausgebrochenen Tirol die alte Schafe. Me hat sie nicht gewollt überlassen in Shtetl, geschleppt meilenweit ins Stepp. Und da, zu was kann sie nutzen? In Barack geh sie nicht rein. Und so steht sie elend wie Jossem unter dem heuchen Himmel, der einzige Edes von der frierdike Zures. So, the passive description of the Schafe being dragged across the land with its hunched demeanor and missing doors is full of affect. The use of the diminutive Tirol and the adjective alt double as terms of endearment and reveal the intimacy that the object holds, years of accumulative sentimental value. But even the passive voice and the heart-rending description cannot take away the agency of the object. One glance from Ryback immediately conjures both the fabric of Jewish life and the catastrophe that ensued. And we see it in Shtetl Steger and frierdike Zures that serve as oppositional ends. Loshen Kodesh nouns such as Yosem and Tzuras single out the cardinal sin of being a Jewish object, while Adis makes clear its resilience and current function. The Shafe is here to invoke memory, to make sure that the past is not left behind, which is not unusual if you think about avant-garde, about the main avant-garde gesture that we're familiar with. Finally, the adjective eingeheukelt, so crooked or hunched, is key to our understanding of Ryback's formulation of material culture. The adjective first appears in the opening paragraph, and it depicts a typical small-town Jew. So, oft pflegen zu mir meine Freund sagen, Ot gitter vor Take Ryback, was kennt nur dem eingeheukelten, klein Shtetl-dicken, blassen Jiden, dem Händler, Meckler, Socherer. So using the same adjective to describe the Jew and his belongings establishes a kinship between subject and object, and the Shafe becomes a comrade, an object whose formal attributes make visible a shared ideological function. So to conclude, I hope that I managed to show how by reprioritizing formal over thematic susceptibilities, I would say, Ryback managed to produce a body of work that authorized the status of Jewish material and visual culture. By calling maximum attention to everyday objects, he manages to unsettle the Jewish representational realm and redefine the mimetic terms of painting. Then, by transforming the object into an agent of defiance, Ryback's formulation of Yiddish art renders the visual and form and material tenets of art not only ethical, but crucial and vital to Jewish purview. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Noah. That was really, really fascinating. I just want to tell the audience, if you do have questions for Noah, please put them in the Q&A section. And also, correct me if I'm wrong, you were interested in possibly getting comments about.
Yes, that would be lovely. If
Comments.
anyone has a thought or an interesting, any feedback, I would very much welcome it.
Right. That'd be great. So if you have any comments, please leave them in the Q&A section. I think at Evo, we generally don't request comments, but we get them anyways. But yeah, if you're interested in and have a comment, please let us know and leave it in the Q&A section, not in the chat.
For the sheer reason that I'm still writing the dissertation, so I could use some thoughts. Right.
So I'll start with a question, or I don't know if it's entirely, I guess it is a question. One of the things that you see here is that, Ryback, as you said, like like other avant-garde artists, deform their subjects. And this is an interesting historical phenomenon because you have portrayals of Jews as deformed from the Haskalah on.
Yeah.
And this is something that makes its way into different political ideologies, ranging from Zionism to communism to even, social ideologies like assimilationism, where, the Jews, traditional Jews of the Shtetl, are conceived of as deformed. Even their language is deformed. So, it seems like this is a very broad concept, and it plays out in different ways, but it also plays out in similar ways in a lot of these ideologies. And I'm just wondering if you'd be willing to comment on that.
Well, I think it's a great observation, one that I haven't thought of, but I should think about in terms of Jewish body versus Jewish object, right? The deformation of the Jewish body, and it's the reception of that stereotype and the deformation of the object. I think I certainly have thought about the deformation of the deformation of the object, but not enough the deformation of the body. And I think that here, what I tried to make, to convey is that the deformation here is used in order to call attention to tenets that were usually marginalized in Jewish culture, which are, it's like usually when we think about cultural production in Jewish culture, it's, the people of the book, the text. We orbit around the auditory or the literary. And for many different reasons that perhaps, justify a different talk, the misconception of aniconism has become very prevalent. And what I see particularly within the Soviet Yiddish avant-garde is that through the deformation of the objects, which is a different type of manipulation, artists were able to draw attention to this precise marginalized notions. So these are materiality or embodiment or physicality, palpability, all those notions that were kind of overlooked. And by deforming, they're actually trying to reclaim them, annex them anew, to perhaps make it right, just like we saw with that Abraham Effel's quote, so deforming in order to make it right, not separated from this action. In terms of how it relates to the Jewish body, other than this like kinship that I started to talk about in the mid-20s, which is perhaps could be, a precursor to the way that the Soviet handled their own, the way that the Soviet formulated the relation between subject and body and subject, body and commodities. But aside from that, I'm not sure that I have an answer yet. I will have to think about it. Definitely.
Okay, food for thought. I'm wondering maybe you should stop your screen share just so we can, unless you want to show some of the images.
I do that.
So I see that there are people leaving questions and comments in the chat. Please put them in the Q&A section and not the chat, because it's harder for us to see that. Wait, Noah, you stopped
I'm
your
here. Oh, you said
yeah, no, I meant to stop your screen share.
There you go. See, that's how yes. I'm not
There you
well
go.
versed with
It's
Zoom,
fine.
even though I've been there for so long.
It's fine. Don't worry. Okay, so we have a question from Carrie Wallach. She wants to know if you know what artist Ryback got to know when, or if he collaborated or exhibited with while he was in Berlin, and if he befriended or worked with any Jewish women artists,
Oh,
either
women.
Berlin or Paris.
Well, in Berlin, he was part of German modernist groups at the time, and he was showing at least two exhibitions in two separate German galleries while there. So during a three-year stay in Berlin, he managed to produce quite a lot. He also had another, I'm not sure if it's a lithographic album or not, I can't remember, but portraits of Ukrainian Jews that he presented there. In terms of collaboration with Jewish female artists, I'm not sure. There were a bunch of Jewish female artists in the original group of the Kulturliga artist section. But they were numerous, and most of the attention obviously went to male artists. They have been written about mostly from a biographical standpoint, monographic standpoint, but not extensively. I can't remember their names. I think Sarah Shaw was one of them, but I can't really recall. And in terms of his production in Paris, when he arrived in Paris, he went back and forth between Paris and London for a while and also exhibited. I don't know of any collaborations with other artists, but he passed away fairly young from tuberculosis. So I think any chances of further collaborations were tragically severed by his premature death. Yeah, but I can't tell you if there were other collaborations with female Jewish artists.
Okay, here's a really interesting question from Romney J. Walker Wood. He says he's struck by the light in the picture of the field, particularly how it passes through the agricultural tools while shadow collects in the gravitational pull of the wardrobe. Can you speak a bit more about Ryback's use of light in the images you've shown or in his other work?
Hmm.
So do you want to go back to script sharing your screen so you can show these images? Feel free to do that.
How to do that now? Hold on. Can you see?
Yeah.
All right, so here, right? Definitely, I think it reinforces what I suggested before, that the focal attention of this painting is not the landscape or the periphery of the frame, which rightfully, as Romney suggested or pointed out, there is, it's a very I wouldn't say it's a lit frame because it's Abendstimmung, it's an evening, so maybe the distribution of light is equal, but I'm not sure how much light there was to begin with. But whatever it was, it certainly is visible that the barak or the hut and the shafe next to it attract most of the light and become this, like this dark focal point that almost seems like what do you call it in English? Like a gateway into the past, like a threshold into the past. So the door that is half opened into a very dark void, and there is no door at the entrance to the hut. So it seems like a threshold to me, into a different time and a different place. And in terms of light, the use of light in the previous lithographic album in Shtetl, here I just think that it serves a very, the expressionist tone. It's very dichotomous. It's like an interplay between negative and positive. We see how hold on. We see here that the eyes, that the eyes are completely empty. There is no eyeballs, and often it's just the contour of the eyes that is heavily shaded. And we also see it in the flower in plate number 7 in Zal, in the living room, where there's an imprint of the flower, but it looks like the flower is missing, and all that is left of it is a shadow. So we can, I mean, these are all open-ended interpretations, or of, I don't know, suggestions of meaning that we could ascribe to it, but I think it really serves well the expressionist tone that is in the frame.
Okay. Going back to the question of deformation, David Brown, and I don't know if this is a question or a comment,
From
but
David, I really hope it's a comment.
he says, and the deformation of these Jews is not an act of uglification. It
Um,
sounds like a statement that it's not an intentional act of making them ugly. I don't know.
Well, you can certainly notice a shift between the representation of Jewish bodies in the first album and the representation of Jewish bodies in the
Sure.
second album. And we can talk about the fact that this was, an assigned job to begin with, and that there was some sort of an agenda, that he was assigned to convey. So whether or not the image that he needed to produce of Jews that are sunburned and happy and healthy from their time, working the land is his own authentic impressions, or was it, assigned from above, the JGC meaning, that is still unclear. I mean, I don't have the documents to prove any political standing to any direction, but we can also think about it in terms of a precursor to socialist realism, perhaps, because, this is something that only happened in Soviet culture much later. And here we have, an institutional body that specifically assigns specifically assigns criteria for the production of art. And we can see how the representation complies to those criteria, right? So if here they are all like eingeheukelt and crooked and hunched without eyeballs. Everything is very black and white. Then once we move over and shift to 1926, the Jewish agricultural settlements, it's a different way of representing a Jewish body altogether. Yeah.
Interesting. Okay, Oksana Rosenblum asks if you know if Ryback had an interest in children's book illustration and was possibly influenced or inspired by other examples he saw, like those that El Lissitzky did. And I
Yeah.
think Evo actually republished, I think, a book by Miriam Margolin that a children's book that he illustrated. So yeah, if you
Yeah, definitely. I mean, illustration of children's books was a big like big avenue production of the Kulturliga. It was one of their main projects. And this was a way to not only get by with the censorship, but also to educate and kind of indoctrinize future generation for some sort of a very coveted modern Yiddish culture. So Ryback definitely took part in that. He illustrated many children's books over the years. Most of them during his Kiev and Berlin period. After that, he no longer illustrated children's books. But yeah, most of them are not even rare. You can find them on WorldCat and in various libraries or archives. And with the recent like interest in Ryback, there have been a few exhibitions that also showed the sketches for the illustrations and so on. So in terms of specific books that he did, so there was the Miriam Margolin, which is I have all of it written down, but I can't remember it by heart now. It's do you remember which one is that?
the book that he
The
book
kleine Meiselach,
I think it's like Drei Kleine Meiselach or something. I'm not
yeah,
I don't
something with Meiselach and obviously kleine and Kinderlich, obviously. But I don't recall. I don't have the specific title here. I would be happy to send you a full list of all the children's literature that he illustrated. It's yeah, it's absolutely mapped out, not just by me, but previous scholarship.
Right. Okay. So one quick question. Valerie's asking what medium did Ryback use?
So I think he was moving, he was during his ethnographic expeditions, we see a lot of sketches that were done with watercolor, pencil. Then we move on the reworking of these original initial sketches into lithographic albums, which is some sort of a print. We also know that he did, I mean, there's a lot of oil painting that he produced throughout the years. So watercolor, drawing, oil painting. In Paris, he took on ceramics. So you have little ceramic figurines of, again, portraying Jews of the Shtetl. And other than that, he was also writing theoretical texts, if that's, something you would consider an artistic medium. So, he was producing art and also thinking critically about art and writing about it in Yiddish. I think that's what he was working with.
Right. David Brown has chimed in again. So he's saying that they're not caricatured as in much tendentious representation. I don't know if David means, let's say, anti-Semitic caricature, or, works that portray Jews as, in sort of stereotypical situations. I don't know exactly what he's intending here.
Which album are we talking about here?
He doesn't say. Maybe he'll chime in again. We'll take another question. We only have a minute or two left. But there's one last question from Elaine Wilson, who asks, says that she's interested in the remark from Ephros, that the artist of the future will come along and straighten out the crooked images of contemporary art, like the Lord God. And she asks if there's an implicit utopianism in this remark, And to what extent is Ryback's art actively resisting such an ideological stance? And she says she's thinking of about this in tension with the idea of the new earthy Jew of the Soviet future.
Yeah, definitely. So I think there's definitely a play between utopia and dystopia, as far as dystopia insofar as it is probably, if anything, it's the present or the past. I think everything that he could possibly, everything that was possibly dystopian had already happened. Certainly in 1917 and after, with the Civil War and the pogroms that ensued. Insofar as resisting an ideology, that's something that we have to uncover very, very delicately, because if we look at this album, it's not something that is extreme, that is visible. Most of the plates in the album are very coherent in terms of the way they represent, again, the Jewish body or the landscape, or objects around. And to me, the Shafa was the only thing that stood out as something that was not the only thing, but one of the few things that stood out as ideologically subversive. So that's why I chose to focus on that. And in the dissertation, I hope to, there's other objects that I refer to. But these are, I think, the objects that are the most interesting, because they're the one who kind of set up the tension between utopia and dystopia.
Okay, so David chimed in again. I think he's saying that that Reebok's drawings are not caricatured, either like politically motivated caricatures or anti-Semitic caricatures of Jews.
Yes. Yes, I completely agree, and I think it's a, I think it's a multifaceted, reflective representation that takes into account not only the Jewish subject, but rather the entire, like I said, like the entire history of representation in Jewish culture, not necessarily of people, but representation as such, as an aesthetic idea. So I think that what he offers us is a very, is a quite critical stand to representation, that goes well beyond tropes of anti-Semitism or any other trope.
Okay. Thank you so much. This is all we have time for. Thank you all so much for attending and with your questions. And thanks so much to Noa Tsaushu, YIVO's 2023-2024 recipient of the Ruth and Joseph Kremen Memorial Fellowship in European Arts, Music, and Theater. We also would like to thank the Kremen family for providing funds for students like Noah. And if you like what you saw and heard today, please consider making a donation to YIVO, because we can't support these students without your help. So thanks everyone so much. And we have another fellowship lecture by Netta Ehrlich on Wednesday. So if you'd like to attend that, please do so. Thanks everyone so much. Take
Thank
care.
you so much, Eddie, and everyone. Bye.